like we haven't been there before, right? And we're going to pick up at verse 20, and we're going to talk about the patriarchs today of having faith. Remember, we know the definition of faith from Hebrews 11, 1 through 3, and now we move to illustrations of different faith. We walked through many of those who are in the book of Genesis. Well, today we're going to cover actually chapter 27 to chapter 50. Are you ready? Let me just say this. If you are a Bible student, if you really want to dive into all the stories, I suggest you go back and read these passages because they're interesting. And they give you the ebb and flow of these men's lives. But the Hebrew writer gives each one of them a verse. And in that verse, he simply states certain things. To be honest with you, originally we were going to take this each man, each week. But there's a message given in these three that I think are important for us to understand together, collectively. And so let's look in Hebrews chapter 11, and let's begin at verse 20. By faith, Isaac invoked future blessings to Jacob and Esau. By faith, Jacob, when died, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. You want to underline that if you have a book Bible, because that's an important phrase. By faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of Israelites and gave direction concerning his bones. Hebrews 11, 20 and 22 cover three generations. They cover Isaac's generation, Jacob's generation, and of course Joseph's generation. These would be considered the three generations of Abraham, Father Abraham. But it's also interesting to know that in the biblical context, what does a patriarch really mean? We use that phrase, patriarch, today. We often use it in our culture to represent a certain person, a male who leads a family. But what really is a patriarch? Well, in strict terms, it's a founding father. It's of a family. It has the idea of a tribe or a covenant, a people whom would pick a patriarch to be their leader. It has promise and purpose to it. It really means a father ruler or a chief father. But in Scripture, what does it mean? What does it mean about these three great fathers that we read of the book of Genesis? One is Abraham. Well, he's the man God called. We've talked about him a lot. He's the man God called, with whom God established what we know of as the Abrahamic covenant. He had a son named Isaac who was the promised one, and through him that covenant continued. Notice the path. And then you come to Jacob, whose 12 sons would be what? The 12 tribes of Israel. Now, a patriarch is more than an ancestor. He serves as head of the family. He provides leadership and direction. And by the way, every family needs a patriarch. Every family needs a father figure that people respond to, and that's why family is so important. It's a spiritual leader. He builds the altar for them. He worships God. He shows them how to and teaches truth. He's also a covenant recipient. He receives God's promises. And he's a bearer of blessings, passing God's promises to future generations. But in this passage, the emphasis is not on all the things these guys did. Because if you read the book of Genesis, these guys had a lot of activity. But dealing with faith, the Hebrew writer says, we're going to talk about the end of their life. How did the patriarchs pass on what God had given them? You see, the role here is not merely a role to produce descendants. but to transfer faith to the next generation. Please hear that. You and I are not here when the Bible talks about we're to reproduce. It's not just in the natural form of having children. It is our responsibility to pass faith to each generation. And that's what is passed on in Hebrews 11, 20 through 22, is that these who live by faith and these who walk by faith at the end of their life handed it off to the very next generation. Now, a patriarch is a covenant father who's chosen by God to lead his family. And if you read the New Testament, all of us have been called as dads and fathers to lead our families and pass God's promises to a next generation. Now, we understand our children all have a free will and get to make decisions, but it's our goal to pass it on. You see, each man standing near the end of his life, his faith caused each one of them to look beyond themselves, to trust God in the dying moments that God's covenant promises would continue. See, their faith did not enter or center around what they could see, but what God said. See, your faith is often what you see, right? Instead of what God says. Big difference. Because sometimes I can't see what God's promise says. I can't even comprehend in some sense to wrap my mind around what God's promise says, but yet I have been called to not trust what I see, but trust what he says. So let's look at three things, these three gentlemen, these three patriarchs. Notice verse 20, first of all, faith perceives the promise. We talk about Isaac. By faith, Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. Notice the phrase, future blessings. In the patriarchal times, the father passed two important things to his eldest son. Not all sons, the eldest son. You know, we live in an American culture, right? And we say every child should get what? Same thing, equal share. I remember I used to do estate plans and people say, I want it divided equally. And I'm thinking, that's not how they did in the Old Testament. The eldest child got a whole lot more than everybody else. But there were two things. You passed on the birthright, which was the physical inheritance. Remember, that's what Jacob and Esau will have, this tug of war and deception and drinking their own kind of soup and all kinds of stuff. You see, I think you have to also understand the second one's not birthright, but blessing. The spiritual inheritance. It's one thing to pass on all the money. It's one thing to pass on all the house or all the goods or all of whatever that is that we've accumulated over life. And they understood there needed to be a birthright place. But there also needs to be a blessing. Dying moments, passing our faith on. Verse 20 covers Genesis 27 and Genesis 28. Isaac's blessing was prophetic and rooted in God's covenant with his father Abraham concerning future blessings. Notice the phrase again in our passage, invoked future blessings. I think the King James says concerning things to come. Emphasizes the future realities are not yet visible. You can't see them. Though physically blind, Isaac spiritually saw God's purpose. It's interesting to see the spiritual journey of Isaac. How he perceives God's promise. And he perceives what God is going to do, and he understands, I don't see it, but I know God's going to do it. You see, you and I live in a world where we want to live on our own sight. I don't see that, people will say to me often. I don't understand. You ever hear somebody say, I don't understand? That's a great cop-out for saying, I don't want to be told what to do. Because you see, you and I can only see what God sees. And we don't know what God's... Think about in your life, how many decisions you would have made different if you could only see the future. Think about where your life would be if you could have seen the curves. And listen, there are some roads I would have not got on because some idiot was going to hit me down the road. But you see, the understanding is this. I don't live by what I see. I live by what God promises. His promise. His perception. Notice this truth. Faith sees beyond the present circumstances and trusts God's promises. We often focus on what is immediately before us. But faith keeps an eye on God's greater plan. You know, when a builder builds, he studies the blueprints before the structure. And this is a gift. They can see the building setting in the blank land, or the dead land, or the undeveloped land. And they see it as though it was already what? Built. And I've walked with especially architects and project managers, and they're going, right here's where this is. And I'm thinking, no, there could be a snake right here. I'm not going over in that area. And they say, over here will be this. And I'm going, I don't see this. I'm looking at these prints, and I don't see like they see. Why? Because they're not my blueprints. Are you listening? God's not interested in your blueprint. He's got his own. God has a plan for your life, for my life, and today you and I have the privilege of trusting God's promises through that battle and through that difficulty and through that spiritual journey. Why? I'm going to tell you why. Because faith alone will give you that glorious perception of the promise. But notice, second of all, faith passes the blessing. We come to Jacob. Passes the blessing. It's not enough to sing, I'm blessed, I'm blessed, I'm blessed. You know, we used to sing that. No. Are you passing it? Verse 21. By faith, Jacob, again, he's at the end of his life, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. Jacob's dying. And he's not worried about trying to live longer. He's not worried about how this is all going to spin out. He's an old man. He's gone from living in Israel and having gone through a starvation moment in his life and losing a son to regaining that son back in Egypt, and he's living down there, and all of a sudden death comes. He'll never see home again. It's interesting when you read the story of Genesis 47 and 48. He passes over Reuben, the firstborn of Leah, because of the adultery with Jacob's concubine. And he takes these two sons, and they receive double blessings. Jacob intentionally leans over his staff. You know what you and I would say, don't you? He leaned over his what? Cane. And he crossed his hands. Crossed his hands meant I'm giving the greater blessing to Ephraim. Our children need us to cross our hands. Our grandchildren need us to cross our hands. For you see, it's not what we perceive only, but it's what we pass. What are you passing? Are you passing the blessing? Are you simply talking about the blessing? It's not enough to talk about the blessing. You see, the act demonstrates confidence in God's sovereign choice. Jacob didn't follow what the plan was. He didn't follow the normal what Jewish nation would do. He did not follow what his father Abraham had even taught. Why? Because the sovereign God had taught him a different choice. You know how he dies? He dies not complaining about how bad life is. He doesn't die saying, I wish I was back home, or I wish this had not happened, and I wish that had not happened. And in Jacob's life, I'm sure there were a lot of I wish had not happened. But he dies, Scripture tells us, worshiping the Lord. He wanted one simple journey from here to glory to be simple. From the presence of God to the presence of God. Please hear me. The spiritual blessing you pass to your family will not be what comes out your mouth. It's what you live. Yes. Yes. They're not listening to what comes out your mouth. They're listening to how you function, how you live. I've known a lot of people who knew how to talk the Christian lingo, and they knew how to give that what they thought was spiritual instruction. But their life did not match that. Living it. You know, I've done hundreds of funerals. And hardly ever do I hear somebody say, I remember hearing my mom or dad say thus and so, unless it was something funny. But I've heard a lot of people say, I remember what they did. I remember who they were. Your dying moment is a big deal. And how you die, you pass it on. 2004, I was running for the Kentucky State Senate. It was election day. I'd met a man by the name of Pritchard. Pritchard had never voted for a Republican in his life. And sitting at breakfast one morning, he said, I've decided I'm going to vote for you. This is as true a story as I know. Election day, guess what I was doing? Anybody got an idea what I was doing while everybody was out campaigning? I had 2 funerals that day. And a guy in the hospital. Well, when I left the left the graveyard, I got a phone call from Pritchard's son. And from Pritchard's pastor first and then his son. He said, can you meet us back at the hospital? Pritchard's had a heart attack at the voting booth. Pritchard was unconscious when I got there. His son said to me, Preacher, he voted for you. Said he stepped out and it must have killed him. Because he died. He died on election day. And I wasn't sure how the family felt about me. You know what I mean? And so I get to the emergency room. I find out Pritchard's dead, and he's my friend. He and I have been friends for a good while then. And his son said something profound. He said, well, preacher, I guess Dad taught us to vote Republican from here on. Your last act is a big deal. I remember my mom. Mom didn't know who we were half the time. But that last night before I left, she knew who we were. And she told us she loved us. Those are last acts. What will your last act be? We don't know. But here's what we need to be prepared. Everything we do needs to be the last act. Because you don't know when the last act is. I mean, Kyle Busch, I booed him every chance I got. I'll never forget him taking that guitar here in Nashville and just beating the daylights out of a beautiful guitar. The boy wasn't real smart at times. But a week before he died, he climbed out of a race truck, and a reporter said, how do you keep enjoying doing this or something like that? And he said, because you never know when it's your last one. And it was his last one. Are you hearing me? Your act is important. You and I need to pass on whatever that is. So if I live inconsistent in my faith, if I live inconsistent in my worship, if I live haphazardly in my walk with God, that's what I leave behind. If I'm rebellious and I'm always trying to attack, if I'm sinful, if I'm whatever that is, or if I'm faithful, I pass it on to the next generation. You see, this truth is important. Faith desires to leave a spiritual inheritance to the next generation. Of all the things I can leave, of all the things that will take place, leaving this world needs to be an understanding. I walked with God. I followed God. I was a disciple. See, believers should seek to pass down truth and worship and devotion to those following behind them. If your child walks in your steps, where will they end up? If your grandchildren walk in your steps, where will they end up? If your great-grandchildren... I was in the graveyard last week where my mom and my grandparents are buried, and a young man in a hat working at the graveyard started yelling at me. And I turned around. It's my second cousin. We shook hands. Luke, God's called him to preach. God's using him. And I'm standing there thinking, inside of my grandparents' grave, your inheritance is passing on. We need to pass the inheritance to another generation. You see, when a relay racer gets to the finish line, the race is not done. Because one of the most important things you can do is what? Pass the baton correctly. It does no good to be, we used to do relay races, and there were some idiots. They'd throw it at you real hard, and you couldn't even catch it, and we lost the race. They'd fumble it and drop it. You lost the race. Learning to run and reach that baton is so important. You and I need to run faithfully to the end of the race and hand the baton gently to the next person to take over. But thirdly, we meet Joseph. Oh, I wish I had all day to preach on Joseph. Sometime we may come back and just plow through the book of Genesis. But not today. And you're thankful. Faith proclaims the future. Isaac passed on to Jacob. You know the story of Joseph. As they read the stories through the Psalms and through Stephen's sermon this morning, I was reminded of that continuous thought that God was at work in weaving the lives together. But faith does proclaim the future. Notice verse 22. By faith, Joseph, as he ended at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites 400 years later and gave direction concerning his bones. Now we get to chapter 50. We're at the end of the book of Genesis. You know what Joseph predicts? That God will visit his people. And he said, when you all go back to Israel, make sure and do what? Take my bones. I don't want to be left here in Egypt. This is not my home. You see, when you study the book of Exodus, Moses carries Joseph's bones from Egypt in Exodus 13. And Joshua, in Joshua 24, he will bury those bones. They carried Joseph's bones for 40 years. He was with them when God parted the sea. He was with them when God fed them. He was with them when God had let even Moses die. He's still physically with them. Why? Because the future is important. There are many things that could have been pointed out in the life of Joseph's faith. But like the other two, guess what? It ends with his life. Some people believe he was died in 1778 BC. That'd be a little over 300 years before the Exodus. Others hold 400 years. So somewhere between 300 and 400 years, you can get in a big fight if you want to over it. But Joseph was known as what? The dreamer. The one betrayed by his family. He lived in two places, or three really: pits, prisons, and palaces. He got thrown in a pit. He was thrown in prison twice. And he lived in the palaces. But his instructions was not anything more than about his bones. Why is that important? Because it's part of God's promise. Part of the covenant promises. Joseph looked ahead 300-400 years and said, I want that promise fulfilled. See, you and I think about looking to the future and all we want to do is get to heaven, and that's not God's plan. God's plan is for you and I to be so focused, especially at the end of life, on how we're going to pass the faith on, how we're going to pass the blessing on, how we're going to share the gospel with our families, how we're going to share the gospel with our people. You know, next weekend when we gather for our family camp, we're even going to talk about how our families are engaging in certain things that must and need to be engaged in. Why? Because we've got to pass it on. This is precious stuff. Understand, Joseph spent most of his life where? In Egypt. But he never considered Egypt home. You know, Egypt is the world to us, and we should never consider this world our final home. His instruction concerning his bones reflected only that God was in charge, and he knew God would take care of it. And as he looked past that, notice this truth. Faith lives with confidence that God will fulfill his word. You and I may differ on how God fulfills his word, but he'll fulfill it. You see, do not become so attached to this world that you lose sight of God's eternal promises. I have suitcases. I wear them out. I have one right now that the arm won't hardly go down into the sleeve. When I get ready to go on the plane, I'm over going, oh, please go down, please go down, please go down, because it's going to be a problem if I don't get it down before I get on that plane. But I never pack a suitcase as my final destination. I'm only going somewhere, I'm coming home. Matter of fact, I don't check a lot of luggage these days, but when I'm overseas, I have to. And there's always this concern when I check the luggage in Nashville that it'll get wherever I'm at. My luggage has been places I've never been. They've seen places I've never seen. And some of them are still out there somewhere, never got home again. But when I check it overseas to come back home, I don't care. You know why? Because I got that same stuff right where I'm going. It's home to me. Doesn't matter where you travel. It's where's home. My home is where I live. My home is where my family, my home is where I'm heading to. You ought to keep your bags packed. You ought to keep talking about the promise. Isaac perceived the promise. Jacob passed the blessing. Joseph proclaimed the future. See, faith doesn't merely help us endure the present. It helps us to invest in the future of our children, our grandchildren. Yes, and even our great-grandchildren. Notice this main principle. Faith looks beyond the present and lives with confidence in God's future promises. You plant a tree. That tree's not for you to sit under. It's for the next generation to sit under. Your life and my life is a tree planter that we'll never sit under. But it's for that generation coming behind us, and the next generation, and the next generation. Why? Because we're passing on our faith. We're living like the patriarchs taught us to live. Living in God's promise, yes. Looking to pass the blessing, yes. But also understanding the future is what God's going to do. Swan, can I ask you something? When's the last time you spent a lot of time praying for your children? When's the last time you started investing more than just talk? But you let them know how your spiritual life is. You let them know how you live. You let them know how you're directed. When was the last time you planted the tree and said, I know I'm not going to sit under it, but they are? I was back in that graveyard. I understand my grandmother planted the tree in me, not my mom. I was an adult when my mom came to Christ. But my grandmother taught me some things. One, she read the Bible to me every day. We prayed every day. And Phyllis and I was talking about the other morning, her grandmother, same way when she stayed at Mamaw's house. Mamaw was a little more vicious, though, wasn't she? That's where Phyllis got it from. But anyway, our grandmothers taught us how to do devotions. Now, I didn't like it as a kid. Phyllis, I asked her, she said, I didn't like it either as a kid. And I was thankful I wasn't the only one. But what she put in me has never left me. Yesterday was my 55th spiritual birthday. 55 years ago yesterday, in a little grocery store in the hills of Kentucky, I knelt on Sunday night at 10 minutes till 10 and surrendered my life to Jesus. Quick story. God got my attention, but my grandmother's investment all those years. The day before, we just opened the grocery store. We hadn't been in business more than 4 or 5 months. It was a rainy Saturday, the 29th. And a lady flying down US 23, what was then a 2-lane road, lost control of her car, hit a guardrail, and that car went in the air and cut a telephone pole in two and came back down on the hood. A group of men at the store went out and got the woman and put her on our counter. Now, I watched the woman almost die. I was standing there. I watched the car go up. I watched the whole thing. I was a little 9-year-old kid. And in the back of my mind, it was my grandmother always taught me, be prepared to die. And I thought, this lady just about died. Well, state trooper showed up. I read his book recently, Doug Asher. He's bigger than life. And Doug says that car needs to be turned off or it's going to explode. My mom was afraid her store would burn up. Mom said, Tim will get in there and turn it off. Now remember, it could explode at any moment. And Doug said, you're not putting that kid in there. She said, he don't mind. I'll put him in there. I said, I do mind. I think Doug saw the fear in my face. Well, Doug had to go to the cruiser to do something. Mom said, I'm going to whip your rear end if you don't get in there and turn that car off. And so I get in there, and I'm crawling out as Doug pulls up, walks back up, and he goes, what are you doing? I said, he goes, I ought to put you in jail, Joanne. But the judge had let you out real quick. It was that day, with that brush of death and watching death, that got my attention, but it was my grandmother's investment. When I went to church that Sunday morning, and the preacher preached on the blood, still remember it. It was that day God used her life to pass to me what I'm now passing to my children, my grandchildren. Are we passing it on?